Today is also a day across the nation that we lament and remember those killed by gun violence in our country. These two go together, they go hand in hand. In our gospel today, Jesus tells the disciples to go out, to go and make disciples of all nations. Go and help people remember that they are mine, that they are loved. Help the world to remember that, as we heard in that beautiful Genesis story this morning, each one of us is created in the image and likeness of God. Each of us bears the fingerprint of God. Each of us can reveal the face of God. That's what Ryan has been ordained to proclaim to the world. That's what Ryan will witness to as a hospital chaplain in a busy inner-city hospital. And that is what we observe today on this Wear Orange Sunday. That we belong to one another. That we must take care of one another. Last month, Bishop Dion asked me to go to Washington, D.C. and attend the Bishops United Against Gun Violence Advocacy event. And I said, Bishop, I can't leave Grace. Thomas is on vacation. Philip is away for a while. We got a lot going on. I can't just leave. And so he said, well, find somebody. Well, I turned to my committee. I have an advisory committee for gun violence prevention for the diocese. And I asked Colleen if she would be willing to go. And she immediately said yes. So what we'd like to do today is take a few minutes to let Colleen share with us her experience, what she experienced in Washington as she stood with our bishops and other lay leaders to focus on the mandate of the gospel to care for one another by facing and addressing the epidemic of gun violence that is uniquely American at this time in our history. So let's hold this issue in prayer as we reflect on it together. First of all, welcome, Colleen.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for representing the diocese and representing us at the Bishops United Conference. As you might have guessed, this is my daughter. And so in our history together for 30 years, there have been many times when she's said no when I've asked her to do something. She could have easily said no, but she said yes. And what I want to ask first, Colleen, is why did you say yes?
So I've been recently what I call a free-range Episcopalian. I haven't been going to one specific church, but I've been kind of going to different ones. And part of that is just since COVID and in the demographic I fall in as a young adult who's single, unmarried, that's a small demographic in the Episcopal Church, at least in the Diocese of Missouri. And recently I've kind of struggled to find my place in the church, and I thought this would be a really great opportunity to reconnect with my faith, to meet other Episcopalians who are just as committed to gun violence prevention as I am.
We lived in the town next to Columbine, Colorado, when that horrific massacre happened, and Colleen was young. So I'm guessing, Colleen, that Columbine also had some impact on you.
Definitely. I would have been, I think, in first grade when it happened, and I remember the day that it happened, that evening, there was a vigil, there was a memorial service, and my dad brought my brother and I. He would have been about third grade, so we were early elementary school kids, and we didn't turn away from it. My parents never shielded us from these things, but they showed us and we talked about them. And I can still picture the chain link fence with the flowers and the teddy bears, people hugging each other. And that was almost 25 years ago, and it still stays with me. And that should have been a stopping point. That should have been a moment for us all to say, never again, we can't have this happen. And so many mass shootings have happened since then, I'm sometimes afraid that it'll be forgotten. So that's part of what also propels me forward in this.
Oh, thank you, that makes sense. That's painful. But also taking your pain and turning it into something for the hope of people is really something I'm grateful for. When you go to something like this, you always sort of have expectations. You think you know what it's going to be like and what you might hear. I'm wondering, Colleen, what surprised you at this gathering?
One of the first things that surprised me kind of right off the bat is that I was the youngest person there by a long shot. The next youngest person was probably in their 50s. And when I asked my mom, or when I told my mom, kind of was telling her about it, and she said, "Are you sure you were the youngest? How do you know?" And I kind of laughed and was like, well, if you look around the room, there's a very clear, I skew the demographics here. And I met really wonderful people. We had great conversations, but several people noticed it, and they came up and asked me who I was, and a lot of people thought I was clergy, but I told them that I was there voluntarily, and I was a lay person there on behalf of the Diocese of Missouri. And it highlighted, it was an example to me of how we do need more young people in the church. I would love to have more of these conversations and more of these congregations, more intergenerational communion together. People my age and younger too, all of us care deeply about gun violence. And this is a perfect faith statement to bring my faith into this conversation of gun violence prevention. So that was surprising, but also a good opportunity. But one of the other things that surprised me, or didn't so much surprise me as it really woke me up, was the sheer complexity of the issue. Gun violence does not exist in a vacuum. Our unfettered access to guns are a big part of the problem, but so are things like poverty, mental illness, systematic racism. They all play into gun violence. And gun violence doesn't only relate to the mass shootings that we hear about on the news. A lot of times that's when there's an uproar, when people demand change and there's public outcry, as there should be. These are heartbreaking events. But we should have those same feelings, that same fire to change things when we see the everyday gun violence in our communities, in our cities, and in our country. So the big focus of this event, this advocacy event, was Bishops United talks about the unholy trinity of gun violence, poverty, and racism. They are all interconnected, and all of our speakers spoke on this, and there were a lot of conversations about it. Some examples really quickly we talk about poverty and systematic racism. What do we mean by that? Some of the examples are underfunded schools, food insecurity, if you have unsafe or unreliable housing, or poor public transportation. If you can't get to your job regularly, how do you make money to pay your rent? One of the things that was really surprising to us is that lead poisoning is actually another factor in this. Lead poisoning from unclean drinking water. One of our speakers was from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. His name was Professor Daniel Webster, and he talked a lot about the facts and the figures, the evidence of gun violence in our country. And there is a very strong link between lead poisoning from unclean drinking water to juvenile offending and violent crime. And when there's guns everywhere, unfettered access, there's a link there. One other really quick thing that really stood out to me was this idea of downstream investment versus upstream accountability. So downstream investment the downstream is your community, investing in your community, in organizations, in community centers. That is critically important. These organizations, they need our support monetarily, they need money investment, but also our time and energy. And the upstream is more those who are in leadership, who are the head of these organizations, the lawmakers. There needs to be a balance between them, because if we only focus on the communities, which is critically important, but we're not working to change laws or hold those accountable who are in power, that's only going to go so far, the community work. On the flip side, if we only focus on advocacy and changing laws and holding those accountable, but we don't invest in our communities, even if laws change and we have safer gun laws, we'll still have broken communities that need help. So there should be a balance between the two. We talked a lot about that.
Okay. That's a lot to take in. And I know for me, and I'm sure all of you have experienced, a sense of being overwhelmed by this. It is complex. And what do we do beyond wringing our hands and being upset about it? So I want to ask you, Colleen, after those days really immersed in this subject, what brought you hope?
One of the big things that brought me hope was the fact that this advocacy event was put on by Bishops United against gun violence. Bishops United is a group of over 100 Episcopal bishops, including our own Bishop, Dion Johnson. They work to curtail the gun violence epidemic in the US, and they focus on 4 main areas of public liturgy, spiritual support, sound teaching, and persistent advocacy. And it brought me a lot of hope to see that the top leadership from our church are committed to working for gun violence prevention. That was really, really powerful and really good to see. Another thing that brought me hope, we had so many incredible speakers from all different walks of life, and I would love to talk about them all, but I don't have time. But one person who particularly stood out to me was our keynote speaker the first night. Her name was Ryan Nickens, or is Ryan Nickens, and she is the founder of the Trey Ron Center in DC. She grew up in the 8th Ward in DC, which she's no stranger to gun violence. She lost her 2 siblings, Tracy and Ronnie, who Trey Ron, that's their names put together, so this center is in their honor. She also lost her uncle, and her mother and another sister have been wounded by gun violence. So she knows firsthand the trauma and the devastation of gun violence, and she had a beautiful response to it. She ended up getting her master's in divinity from Howard University, and she works now, this Trey Ron Center is a center that helps kids who are ages 4 to 16. So these are children from preschool to high school who have been deeply affected by gun violence. And it works to help heal them through the arts, through programming, scholarship, and consulting. It gives them a safe space so that they can work through their trauma in order to heal their own trauma before they can go out into their communities. So it was just really beautiful to see that she had such an inspirational story. It was really an example of living out the gospel and being the hands and feet of Jesus. I just wanted to leave you with a quick quote from her that was really powerful. She said, "I was dry bones, and someone breathed hope and encouragement into me. I'm going to breathe it into others. This is the breath that God has called me to breathe, and I will breathe it."
What do you want to leave us with today, Colleen?
I think there are 2 main things I would like to leave everyone with. One of our first speakers was a pastor from Holy Trinity United Baptist Church in DC. His name was the Reverend George Gilbert Jr., and he talked a lot about our response to gun violence, our gun violence prevention actions in terms of being Christians, church-going people. How do we as church people respond to this epidemic? And one of the questions he asked was how do we address this culture of killing as a church? We do live in a culture of killing right now in the United States, and 2 of the answers that he gave that really were a lot of food for thought to think about. One of them was to look at your church's budget. He said you can tell a lot about what's important to a church by looking at their budget and where the money goes. What ministries do you have in your church, and what money do you have to go to these? I think that's a really great thing for all of our churches to do as we work for gun violence prevention. Another thing is to not just see how your church connects as a congregation, but how your church engages with their community. So it's critically important. It's so important to have a strong congregation. That's really good. Then how do you as a strong congregation go outside of the church walls into your community? So that left me with a lot of food for thought. One last thing I want to leave you with was another quote from Daniel Webster. He was the professor from Johns Hopkins. He said, "We can't do it all, but we each can do something, and together each of those things can make a big difference." So this issue of gun violence, as we talked about, is deeply complex, and it's easy to look at it and to get overwhelmed or to think, I can't do anything to fix this. But what I learned from each of these speakers from all walks of life and all different facets of their jobs is that each of us can do something. We all have different gifts and talents that we can use to work for gun violence prevention. It could be working on early literacy with children, teaching them how to read. It could be working for safe housing initiatives, working with a place like the Trey Ron Center that helps kids heal their trauma. There are so many things to do, and so I ask all of you, and I ask myself this too, what are you going to do with your gifts and talents?
Thank you, Colleen. Ryan, Bishop Dion gave you 2 charges yesterday at your ordination. I know you remember what they are, but I'll say them for you. He said, love God's people, all of God's people, and show up. You're called now to do that as a leader, as an ordained priest in the church. We are all called as baptized Christians to make Christ known in the world. And we're all called to share in this mission of the renewing of the world. In just a moment, we will offer our prayers of the people. And I would urge us to pray in remembrance, to pray in lament as we cry out to God, and always to pray in the hope of the God who created us, Jesus Christ, our risen Lord, and the Holy Spirit, the fire of love. Amen.